Okay, hello everyone. This is Bhavik Choksi here. Hope you guys are doing great. Studies are going in full swing. So the agenda for today's lecture is to do a full revision for your Inter-CA paper number 5, Advanced Accounts. We will be covering everything, including the accounting standards and the topics. So we are not going to solve any sums or do any problems over here, but the idea of this is to have a very quick roundup. So it's a one full lecture where you can kind of refresh all the concepts. It has been some time since you would have completed your coaching, and hopefully you would have done a revision after this. So this will give you a full-fledged overview. We'll try to refresh your concepts. Okay. So let's get started. We'll start with accounting standards. We'll do it in the same manner in which we have done in class. So this is close to 180 hours of content, which we are trying to kind of sum it up in just around about 3 odd hours. So let's try to be as efficient as possible. Where required, we'll stop for a small break or a breather, but otherwise we'll not really solve problems. We'll focus on getting our overall understanding, and I'll go through certain concepts like rights or deferred tax, etc. in a little more detail so that complex topics are also as well addressed. So we'll start with the part on accounting standards. Most of this will involve just absorbing the concepts. So just try to be as attentive as possible. Okay, so we'll start with accounting standards. In terms of your weightage, this will come for around 20 odd marks. Most of the compulsory questions do end up coming from the accounting standards. We will do the accounting standards in the sequential order, starting with AS4. So when we look at AS4, this is events occurring after the balance sheet date. Not a very important standard. So what is there in the post-balance sheet period and what are events occurring after the balance sheet date? So the post-balance sheet period starts from the balance sheet date and continues up to, I'll be just writing this in rough, so it's not really a full-fledged notes. All of these notes are there with you already. So the post-balance sheet period starts from the balance sheet date and it continues up to the date when the directors sign the accounts, not the date when shareholders approve, not the date when the auditor signs, not the date when you file it, but the directors sign the accounts. Now, this period, which starts from the balance sheet date, is called as the post-balance sheet period. When we look at the post-balance sheet period, there are two types of events that happen in the post-balance sheet period. There can be certain events that pertain to conditions existing on the balance sheet date. These types of events are called as adjusting events, pertain to situations existing on the balance sheet date for which you get additional information after the balance sheet date. What do you do with the adjusting events? Well, you adjust them in the accounts. So these are adjusted in the financials, not just a disclosure, but adjusted in the financial statements. What are non-adjusting events? Well, these are material events. Not each and every event, material events which happen in the post-balance sheet period. Something like a fire, something like a loss due to earthquake, which happen in the post-balance sheet period and pertain to conditions not existing on the balance sheet date. So for example, there was no fire on the balance sheet date. In the post-balance sheet period, in April, there was a big fire and there was a big loss. This loss by fire, you will just disclose. So non-adjusting events which are material, or there is an amalgamation that happens in the post-balance sheet period, you will merely disclose this. A disclosure will be given for the same, typically in the notes to accounts, can also be given in the director's report. Now, when we look at adjusting events, the example for this would be probably a sale that you have made in the month of February with a 3 months credit, which expires in April. Now, in April, you realize that the data has gone bad, and hence this is treated as adjusting because the inability to pay existed as on 31st March as well, just that you are not aware because we did not go to approach the debtor. So your entire standard revolves around various cases like bad debts, like amalgamations, where you have to figure out whether a particular event which is happening during the post-balance sheet period is adjusting or non-adjusting. Remember, if an event happens after the post-balance sheet period, it is not even disclosed because the directors have signed the accounts. Even the notes to accounts are not altered. If it happens during that intermediate period, it is disclosed. If it is non-adjusting, it is adjusted in the accounts if it is treated as adjusting. It's a very basic and an easy standard. Then you moved on to AS5. AS5 is on net profit. AS5 is on net profit, then prior period items, and changes in accounting policies, and also changes in accounting estimate. Now, in terms of the presentation for net profit, I'll just prepare this in rough. In terms of presentation for net profit, the net profit over here should be disclosed separately from ordinary activities and extraordinary activities. What are extraordinary activities? Well, extraordinary activities are those activities which are clearly different from the manner in which the entity operates, something like a casual winning or a lottery winning, and that is beyond the control of the entity. So if you win a lottery, that is an extraordinary income, or if there's a loss due to earthquake, that is also an extraordinary item. And hence these items have to be disclosed separately. On the face of the income statement, these items have to be disclosed separately. What about ordinary activities? Ordinary activities may involve all of these activities, like even paying salary, rent, etc., which are connected to your operations. They are in the course of your ordinary operations. These are called as ordinary activities, and within ordinary activities there is something called as it's not specifically defined in the standard, but there are certain items which are called as exceptional. Exceptional items may be gain or loss due to sale of a big plot of land. Now, this plot of land you are using for your business, you don't regularly or frequently sell it, but you will sell it once. At one point of time you might sell it, and hence if these items, they may be connected to your business, but if due to the nature or due to the frequency or due to the size this requires a separate disclosure, you will disclose it separately. You can roughly call this as an exceptional item, though this is not specific. The word extraordinary has been specifically mentioned in the standard, exceptional has not been mentioned. So extraordinary items, if they are material, basically जिसको अपन loosely exceptional बोलते हैं, if they are material, looking at the size or looking at their frequency, then they should be disclosed. All other items may not be separately disclosed. They might be aggregated together and they can be shown. So while presenting net profit, extraordinary items have to be separately shown, and within ordinary items, items which are material, looking at the size or frequency. For example, a big loss by fire or earthquake, etc., which is extraordinary, can be shown, should be shown separately, and ordinary activities, if it is a large item, infrequent item, can be shown separately. Other items may be aggregated. Prior period item or a prior period error. What does a prior period error? Well, error represents, or a PPI or a prior period item represents an error, a mistake, or an omission. I'll again repeat, this is clerical in nature. It represents an error, mistake, or an omission which arises in the earlier period and it gets detected in the current period. So over here, this is a mistake, error, or omission. Mistake, error, or omission, which arises in the previous period and gets detected in the current period. Okay, so what do we do? Let us say you forgot to recognize an item of sale. वो invoice आपके नजर से रह गया था. Now you will recognize it, but then that will go into the revenue of the current year, and it might appear that the revenue of the current year is higher, and hence we will disclose it separately under the heading of a prior period item. So PPI or a prior period items will be recorded in the year when they are detected, and they are to be disclosed separately as a prior period item. Are we getting this? Yes. Okay. So this is about PPI. Again, needs to be disclosed separately. Acha, what is the difference between extraordinary item and exceptional item? Well, extraordinary items are not connected to your operations. They're clearly distinct from your operation. Something like a lottery has no connection to your operation. You might be a CA firm. A lottery winning has no connection with your operation. However, you might be a CA firm and you might own an office, and you might sell that office at one point in time, and you might recognize a big gain. So the gain on sale of the office is exceptional, not extraordinary, because it is connected to your operations. But earning a lottery winning is not connected to your operations at all, and hence it is to be treated as extraordinary. So that is the difference between exceptional and extraordinary. Achha, change in the accounting policy. A change in accounting policy has to be adjusted retrospectively. What is an example of a change in accounting policy? A change from, let us say, FIFO method of inventory to a weighted average method of inventory is to be treated as a change in accounting policy. We need to give a retrospective effect for this. A change in accounting estimate, for example, change in the useful life of a fixed asset for the purpose of calculating depreciation, is a change in accounting estimate which has to be applied prospectively. So this is a gist and an overview of AS5. Then we come to the next standard. I think we have AS7. Then this is on construction contracts. Now these are two connected standards. There is AS9 and there is AS7. AS9 is on revenue recognition. AS7 is on construction contracts. Both of these standards essentially focus on you trying to calculate revenue. Now, to whom will AS7 apply? AS7 applies to contractors who are constructing long-term assets. I am in the infrastructure business as a contractor like Hindustan Construction Company, etc., and I'm constructing bridges, highways, in which case ideally if I were to follow regular revenue recognition principles, the revenue will be recognized when the risk and reward incidental to the ownership of the highway is transferred. On the other hand, well, if I wait for such a long period of time, then it might happen that there will be suddenly one fine year where huge revenue is recognized, in other years almost no revenue is recognized, and hence AS7 comes into the picture. And AS7 says that if there is a contract whose outcome is determinable, that is, if there is a contract, I want to estimate the contract revenue, and if there is a contract whose outcome is determinable. What do you mean by outcome is determinable? Well, it means that the contract revenue as well as contract cost can be estimated. These estimates might change, but reliably you can estimate the contract cost and revenue. इसको बोलते हैं outcome is determinable. Contract cost and revenue can be estimated. If they can be estimated, then the standard requires you to follow revenue recognition on a stage of completion or on a percentage completion basis and not on a full completion basis. Usually, as per AS9 principle, you should recognize the revenue when the risk and reward incidental to the bridge gets transferred. We are not going to wait for such a long period of time. Instead, you will recognize the revenue based on the stage of completion. How do you calculate the stage of completion over here? So over here, SOC or the stage of completion is calculated as the cost incurred. Usually this is the most common way, cost incurred. So work jitna bhi aapne kiya rahega, for the work that is done you might have incurred cost. So cost incurred upon the total estimated cost. And how do you calculate the total estimated cost? Well, this is cost incurred till date upon the estimated cost to be incurred. ये अगर अपन दोनों का टोटल लेते हैं, so this will give you the total cost to be incurred, and hence this will give you the stage of completion. So if there is a project which involves a spending of 500 crores and till date you have spent 200 crores, that means out of, irrespective of how much you see physically in the project, out of 500 crores, 200 crores have been spent, and hence 40% of the project is over. Well, if 40% of the project is over, 40% of the revenue should also be recognized. So your revenue to be recognized would be total contract revenue, जो आप estimate कर सकते हो, total contract revenue. Let us say the project has a revenue of 1000 crores into the stage of completion, SOC. I'm writing all of this in short. This is just a summary. Into the stage of completion. अच्छा, stage of completion अपन कैसे calculate कर सकते हैं? जैसे ऊपर अपन ने देखा. So let us say your total revenue estimated was 1000 crores into 40% done, and hence 400 crores should be the revenue recognized till date, because stage of completion is always calculated till date. Less revenue earlier recorded. In the first year, nothing would have been recorded, but in subsequent years, there would be revenue recorded. And hence that will give you the revenue to be recorded in each of the year. However, in rare cases where contract cost or revenue cannot be determined, what will you do? Cannot be determined. Well, the general cannot be determined. The general understanding over here is, if the revenue can be determined but the cost cannot, in which case you will recognize revenue to the extent of cost incurred. तो जितना आप cost incur करते जाओगे उतना आप revenue recognize करते जाओगे till the time you exhaust the entire revenue. Beyond that, you will not recognize any revenue. So आपको पता है 1000 crores का revenue मिलने वाला है. आपको एक project मिला है to dig a mine. Now you don't know how much cost will be incurred, but the government has told you I'll give you 1,000 crores. अभी mine में minerals कितना नीचे उतना cost incur करना पड़ेगा, and hence we don't know how much is the cost to be incurred. So as and when cost is incurred, you will recognize the cost. सामने you will recognize the revenue. No profit, no loss. जितना cost उतना revenue. Once the project is complete, if there's a balancing amount, that will be entirely recognized as revenue. Achha, if cost is also not determinable, so the government tells you the revenue will be based on the minerals in the ground, and how much minerals we don't know. How much cost to be incurred, kitna deep dig karna padega, we don't know. In which case the standard says, well, you cannot apply any kind of stage of completion method over here, and hence in such a case a full completion method, which means once the contract is completed uske baad hi aap recognize karoge, otherwise you cannot recognize it in such a case. Are we getting this? So this is about your contract revenue. What all goes as a part of contract revenue? The agreed price will be a part of contract revenue. Apart from that, if there is an increase in price due to escalation, even that will be a part of contract revenue. If there's a change in the scope of work, you had a 2-lane highway and suddenly you were told to make a 4-lane highway. There's a change in the scope of work. Even that will be a part of contract revenue as long as that scope has been, the change in scope has been agreed. Performance incentives, performance bonuses, will that be a part? Well, they will be a part only when the contract is at a sufficiently advanced stage and it is estimated that the revenue on account of the performance incentives would be earned. Otherwise, you don't recognize it. So if it's a 10-year contract and you have been told that if you complete it in 9 years, you will get a bonus. Abhi aap starting se kuch bhi recognize nahi kar sakte ho. Till the time you are at a sufficiently advanced stage, you are around 8th or 9th year, and you now see that the project is on the verge of completion, only then can you recognize performance incentives. Otherwise, the concept of prudence and conservatism tells you that you cannot recognize any performance bonus or incentives. Acha, what if you estimate a loss in a project at at the first date? Is that possible? Why not? There might be certain contracts that you take in order to build your credentials, even if they are loss-making contracts. Then AS7 requires you to create a provision. It requires you to create a provision for the amount of estimated loss from the very first day, based on the prudence or conservatism principle, that once losses, if there are losses, you recognize them immediately. If there is gains, you recognize them as and when they are earned. So losses provision has to be made immediately for contracts which are expected to have a loss. Fair. Then what all goes as a part of contract cost? Generally the direct expenses, direct material, labor, overheads which are directly linked to construction will be a part of construction cost. You will not include the administrative or the selling and distribution overheads while calculating contract cost. In terms of disclosures that need to be given, you need to disclose the contract revenue, the contract cost, the contract profit, the stage of completion, and among other things, you also have to show, if you remember, something called as gross amount due from/to the customers. Gross amount, ये एक थोड़ा problematic point होता था. Gross amount due from या फिर to the customer. अच्छा, ये अपन कैसे कैलकुलेट करते थे? So we used to calculate the contract cost incurred till date. To this you used to add the profit recognized. If there's a profit, you would add, and if there are losses, then you would subtract. Less losses recognized. Again, losses recognized. I'm just writing this in short. This is the amount that is as per your books of accounts, from which you will subtract the amount, the progress billings that have been received or not yet received. So this is the amount that has been actually billed to the customer. So over here, let us say the cost incurred till date is 1,000. Based on the stage of completion, profit recognized is 100. There is nothing in the loss, and hence ideally 1100 tak ka kaam ho gaya hai. So that is 1100 rupees. However, the progress billings, they can be collected or not yet collected. So this will include progress billings for which money is received or yet to be received. But as long as billing is made, yet to be received, you will add both of these. Let us say you have done a billing of 800 till now, which means there is 1100 worth of work done, but you have done a billing of only 800, which means 300 is the amount due from the customers. If you have done a billing of 1500, then 400 is amount due to the customer. Okay, so this is broadly about AS7. Then you proceed to AS9, which is on revenue recognition. Well, as per revenue recognition, when should you recognize the revenue? Well, when there is no uncertainty as to the collectability. So the revenue for the goods will be collectible. It is not that you are selling and money will not be received. And there's no uncertainty as to the measurability, which means the consideration that you're going to receive is clearly determined and measured. अच्छा, if there is uncertainty, if there is no uncertainty on collectability, अच्छा, अगर आपने आज goods बेचा, let's say अपने relative को या किसी को, and you don't think that any money is going to be received, then what is the point of recognizing revenue? जब भी हमें पता ही पैसा नहीं आने वाला. अच्छा, but what happens in a lot of times is you sell goods, you believe that money will be received, you give credit, but at a later date you realize that this money is not going to be received, in which case you will have to create bad debts. You will not reverse the revenue recognized, you will have to create a bad debt. Achha, revenue recognition principles are different for goods, are different for services, and are different in cases which involve a utilization of resources. Utilization of resources. Achha, in terms of goods, revenue will be recognized when the risk and reward incidental to the goods gets transferred. In case of services, it depends. Services में कभी risk and reward नहीं होता. So it depends on the nature of the service. It depends on the nature of service. The nature of service can be such where there is a particular critical event due to which the revenue can be recognized, like a concert, for example. So revenue on account of that will be recognized once the concert happens. Or in case of a real estate brokerage, broker's income is dependent on the sale of the flat actually happening. However, in terms of coaching, for items like coaching, for example, there is no single critical event, and hence revenue can be recognized over the life of the contract. So revenue can either be recognized based on the proportionate completion method for items like for services like coaching, or can also be recognized on full completion method for items like concerts or brokerage transactions. When we look at utilization of resources, well, incomes over here can be in the nature of either interest is on debt, which is recognized on a time basis, can be in the nature of dividend can be recognized when the right to receive is established, that is when the shareholders have approved in the general meeting. So generally when the right to receive is established. And in terms of incomes like royalty, this is based on the terms and conditions of the agreement. So if the agreement mentions consideration based on percentage of sales, like authors will get consideration based on the percentage of sales copies made, then revenue will be recognized over as and when the sales happen. If it's a lump sum consideration, can be recognized immediately. So it depends on the nature. There are a few special items, like for example, consignment sales. In consignment sales, the revenue should be recognized when the consignee sells it to the final customer. In case of sales subject to inspection or sales subjected to approval, you can recognize revenue only once the inspection is completed and approval is given. If it is sale on return basis, you can recognize revenue once the customer has communicated his intention that he does not want to return, or a sufficient period of time has elapsed beyond which he will not really return products. That is when you recognize the revenue. There are certain other special cases like cash on delivery. For example, you recognize revenue when delivery is made and cash is paid. There can be certain cases like insurance, where revenue is recognized over the period of the insurance. However, if it is insurance agent commission, revenue will be recognized the moment the policy is effective. You don't have to wait for the entire period. Agent does not really care कि आपको पूरे policy में क्या होता है नहीं होता है. The moment the policy becomes effective, the agent will recognize the revenue. अच्छा, if there is a price revision, price revision, if it is agreed by the customer, will also be considered as a part of the revenue in the period when the price revision is actually agreed to or the price revision happens. So this is a broad overview of your AS9. The next standard, I think AS10, 11 and 12, if I'm not wrong, are a part of your of your paper 1. AS14 we will do along with amalgamations. The next standard that we do is AS17. So we jump to AS17. Again, 16 I think is a part of your paper 1. AS14 we'll do along with the amalgamation standard. AS17. What is this standard about? Well, this is about segment reporting. This is a disclosure standard. Where do you disclose a segment report? Well, in the notes to accounts. You don't disclose it as a part of the core financial statements. Like a cash flow statement is a core financial statement. You don't disclose it as a part of core financial statements. Instead, you disclose it in the notes to accounts. Segment report. What are the types of segments? Well, there can be two types of segments. There can be business segments or there can be geographic segments. How do you figure out whether a company has segments or not? Well, it depends on the risk and reward test. So if there are segments or if there are lines of business who have a clearly different risk and reward as compared to the other line of business or geography, it is considered that your entity has various segments. So the identification of segments will be dependent upon the risk and reward that each and every segment has, the risk as well as the reward. For example, if you look at a company like Mahindra might have various businesses like a tractor business and a hotel business, completely different risk and reward, and hence we show them as separate segments. If you look at a company like Infosys, for example, which is software, might operate in Asia, in Europe, in US. Europe, US, Asia having completely different geographic features and hence may be shown as separate geographic segments. So identification of segment is generally done by the management by looking at the risks and rewards that are there in each line of businesses or each lines of geographies. There are various parameters, like you can look at your internal reporting, you can look at your organizational hierarchy to see and identify the segments. Segments can be classified as primary and as secondary. Primary segments are those segments where a detailed disclosure is given. Secondary segments are those segments which are relatively summarized disclosure is given. Primary or secondary again has to be identified by the management. However, if the question remains silent, AS17 tells you that primary segment is the business segment and secondary segment is the geographic segment. Now, once I identify the segments, do I have to report each and every segment? No. There is a rule which is there for identifying the reportable segments. Where is this? There is a rule which is there for identifying the reportable segments, and in reportable segments, these are segments which are mandatorily required to be reported, and this, according to me, is the most important part of this standard. There is something called as a quantitative threshold which is given. What do you mean by quantitative threshold? Well, this is a threshold in terms of quantitative threshold. This is a threshold which is given in terms of important parameters. The three important parameters are segment revenue, segment result, and segment assets. Segment revenue, while calculating, you will take both the external revenue as well as the inter-segment revenue. For your segment to be shown as a part of the segment report, it should be greater than equal to 10% of the total segment revenue. Then comes segment result. Segment result is like the profit. Well, this time around, it can also be a loss. So, revenue kya hota hai? Revenue and assets are typically always positive. But result, that is profit, may be positive or negative. So segment result in absolute terms, absolute means ignoring the sign, should be greater than equal to 10% of the total absolute profits or total absolute losses. Absolute means ignoring sign. You will take all the segments, uske profits ek side pe, all the segments, uske losses ek side pe, and you will select whichever is higher. Why so? Because, well, there might be a profit making segment, there might be a loss making segment. Even if a segment is burning your money, that is also crucial, that is also critical, and hence such a segment should also be reportable. So this is the second criteria. And the third criteria is segment assets. Again, all of these are only those items which are allocable. If it is unallocable, it will not be a part of this working. Is greater than equal to 10% of the total segment assets. Acha, does a segment need to fulfill all the three criteria? The answer is no. It has to fulfill any one of the criteria for it to be reportable. So either one of them getting triggered and your segment is an important segment, it has to be disclosed. You don't have a choice. What if our segment is relatively small? For example, in a big group like Tata also manufactures bicycles. It might have big businesses like steel, like automobiles, like software, but it also has bicycles. Now, bicycles have a separate risk and reward. However, they're very small as compared to the larger operation of Tata, and they're less than 10%. In each of them. Then do I need to mandatorily disclose it? No. But if I want to voluntarily disclose it, can I? Yes. For example, Tata has also had this new e-commerce venture called as Tata Click. It is new, it is emerging, and I want to disclose it even if the 10% criteria is not met. Can I disclose it? Yes, you can. Also, we need to remember that the segments that you ultimately decide, those segments should have 75% of the external revenue. Rest you can show as others. But the segments that you ultimately decide should have 75% of the external revenue being covered within those segments. That is when, if not, then, well, you'll have to keep on adding segments till the time 75% of the revenue is actually attained. So this is about your reportable segments. Then segment report. While you're preparing segment report, what do I have to show in the segment report? Well, for all of the reportable segments, when I'm making the primary segment report, I have to show the segment revenue with a breakup of external and internal segment, then segment result. Achha, but when I take the total of the segment result, it will not tally with the total, that is total net profit that is appearing in my P&L because of some unallocable items, because of some non-operating items, and as a result, I will have to show a reconciliation of the segment result with the net profit of the company. Then you have to similarly show segment assets along with their reconciliation, segment liabilities also along with their reconciliation. So you want to show a reconciliation. Reconciliation is typically for non-operating items, like interest is non-operating in terms of result, or investments are non-operating in terms of assets, and unallocable items. So for example, there might be certain items which you just can't allocate. MD salary, for example, you are just unable to allocate, in which case it will be unallocable in nature, along with the reconciliation. And separately you also have to show just a disclosure of depreciation and the capital expenditure incurred. Now this is to be shown with so much details for a primary segment. Acha, what about the secondary segment? Well, only a brief one-line disclosure, 3 line items to be disclosed: segment revenue, segment assets, and if available, then capital expenditure. These are the 3 items that you can disclose. No reconciliation required, no disclosure of result also required over here. Is it compulsory that every business needs to have a primary and secondary segment? Not at all. In fact, a lot of businesses just may not have any segments. Like our operation is only coaching, in which case there is no segments. In which case we will just give a note in our notes to accounts which says that since the company operates in just one area of operation, that is coaching, in one geography, that is India, there is no segment report prepared. Achha, when you are preparing financial statements, there can be standalone statements and there can be consolidated statements. Do I have to prepare segment report in both? The answer is no. You need to prepare a segment report in the consolidated mandatorily. Standalone, if you are preparing the report in consolidated, standalone may not be prepared as well. Okay, so that is about segment report, a quick overview. Then we go to AS18, which is a standard on related parties. Again, a disclosure standard. Where do you show the related party report? In the notes to accounts. The most important part of this standard is identification of the related party relationships. So who all are related parties? Well, the holding companies, that is the parent, the subsidiary company, subsidiary company and the fellow subsidiaries or co-subsidiaries or the sub-subsidiaries, that is subsidiaries under the same management. So over here, let us say there is Tata Sons Limited, and Tata Sons Limited has two subsidiaries. There is Tata Steel and then there is TCS, Tata Consultancy. Both of them are related parties because they are fellow subsidiaries. They are under the same parent. So they are fellow subsidiaries. So over here, and fellow or co-subsidiaries भी इसको बोल सकते हैं, are related parties. Apart from that, you have joint ventures and associates are also related parties. These are corporate relationships, but can an individual also be a related party? Yes, of course. So if there's an individual also has his family. So if there is an individual along with his family, if the individual along with his family has control, that is more than 50% stake, joint control, that is like a partner, or a significant influence, I'm writing this in short, SI, that is a greater than 20% stake, then if the individual along with his family has a big voting share in the entity, that individual along with his family will also be a related party. Now the individual may not directly have this stake, so there might be an enterprise in which this individual owns, for example, and that enterprise has control, joint control or significant influence, then even the individual will still be a related party. Apart from that, ये तो अपने सिर्फ पैसे का खेल देखा. There are certain personnel, KMP, key managerial personnel, again along with their family, who are key managerial personnel who are in charge of the planning, the control, the directing of the affairs of the entity. Typically the directors, the executive whole-time directors, not the non-executive and the independent directors. The CEO, the CFO, COO, Chief Operating Officers, function heads typically. These are people who are responsible for planning and directing the affairs of the company. They have signing authority, they have signing power, even if they don't have ownership in the form of control or joint control. Because of the signing authority, they can kind of tweak the arm's length pricing. And as a result, key managerial personnel along with their family members will also be treated as related parties. Remember, within key managerial personnel, generally function heads come, CEO, COO, CFO, etc. Directors are also a part of key managerial personnel, but it is only those full-time or executive directors. Part-time directors are not a part of your key managerial personnel. Or entities in which these individuals, entities or enterprises in which these individuals have control, joint control or significant influence, is also a related party for the reporting entity. This is your overall understanding of your related parties. चलो जैसे तैसे अपन ने related party identify कर लिया. Standard tells you there are certain, as a clarificatory point, there are certain entities which are just not related parties. For example, just a major customer or a major supplier or a major distribution agent or a trade union or a bank, they are not related parties. They might have big volumes of transactions, but that does not make them related parties. Achha, what if you identify a particular party as a related party? In which case, if you were to identify a particular party as a related party, in which case you will have to make a related party report, and the related party report appears in the notes to accounts. It appears both in the standalone as well as consolidated notes to accounts. In the related party report, you have to show in the first part the name and the nature of relationship. In the second part, the transactions as well as outstanding balances that have happened during the year, the transactions during the year and the outstanding balances at the end of the year. Name and nature of relationship. Do you have to show it for all the related parties? No. Only for those related parties, with whom control relationship exists. So if there's a relationship of control like a subsidiary or parent entity, then you have to show irrespective of whether transactions have happened or not. However, if there is no relationship of control, then you have to show only if there are transactions during the year. Transactions can be in the nature of sales, purchases, guarantees given, license fees paid, any transaction. And also to be disclosed, the outstanding balances have to be disclosed again, does the related party relationship have to be in existence for the entire year? The answer is no. Even if the related party relationship is in existence at any point of the year, it is still considered to be a related party for the entity. So that is about AS 18, which is on related parties. There are two parts. There are two parts for this standard. First is the identification of related parties, and second is the related party report. In the related party reports, again there are two parts: the name and nature of relationship, and the disclosure of transactions and outstanding balances. Related party relationship has to be in existence at any point of the year. It is not necessary that it has to be in existence for the entire year. Okay, now we come to the big three. AS 19 leases, AS 20 EPS, AS 22 deferred taxes. So when we look at AS 20, this is earnings per share. Within EPS, you have two types of EPS. One is what you call as the basic EPS. One is what you call as the diluted EPS. When we calculate EPS, what is the purpose of this? It is one of the most important financial metric. You actually use the EPS even in calculating the P ratio, price to earning ratio. It's one of the most important financial metric. So where do you show the EPS? On the face of the income statement. When you prepare the income statement on the face, not in the notes to accounts, you will disclose the EPS. Which EPS will you disclose? Well, two types of EPS. First is the basic, second is the diluted. We'll first focus on basic EPS. What do you mean by basic EPS? Well, basic EPS, in the numerator, you will have profit after tax, after deferred tax, after current tax, after everything, after prior period items, after extraordinary items, everything. That is the profit available to the shareholders. However, when you calculate earning per share, you calculate earning per equity share, and hence you will deduct preference dividend as well. Not equity dividend, preference dividend. This will give you the pool of money which is available for the equity shareholders, and hence ideally you should divide it by the number of shares. The problem over here, well, profit is for the period, shares is as on date, and as a result these shares also have to be converted into a for the period number, which you do by calculating what is called as the weighted average number of equity shares. Weighted average number of equity shares. In short, we can call this as VANES. How do you calculate the weighted average? Well, it is calculated taking the time weight. So the period for which shares are outstanding is taken as the base. So if the shares are outstanding for 9 months, then the number of shares into 9 by 12. If they are outstanding for 6 months, then number of shares into 6 by 12 and so on. So this is the time based weighted average. This is your VANES, weighted average number of equity shares calculation. Then in the numerator you have PAT minus preference dividend. While calculating PAT, you subtract all expenses, you also subtract tax, you subtract prior period items, extraordinary items, everything. You will separately from PAT subtract preference dividend, even though it is an appropriation, because in the denominator you don't take all shares, we only take equity shares, and hence in the numerator you need to have the profit available for equity shareholders. That will give you what you call as basic EPS. Acha, is there any, are there any special cases over here? Yes, you have partly paid shares. Acha, if there are partly paid shares, what do? Well, you usually take time-based weighted average. Yes, you will still, but if the shares are partly paid, they are not comparable to the fully paid shares. And hence what you will have to do is you will have to convert them into equivalent fully paid up shares. So 1000 shares of, let us say, face value rupees 10, if they are rupees 2 paid up. If they are rupees 2 paid up, that means these 1000 shares have given you consideration worth rupees 2000, which is equivalent, if these were fully paid shares, that is equivalent to 200 fully paid shares. So you will convert them into equivalent fully paid shares and then take it in the EPS working. Acha, then comes another tricky point. What if there are bonus shares? Acha, if there are bonus shares, remember bonus shares are issued without consideration. The company does not receive any consideration, but it issues more shares out of its own reserves. Now what might happen is, if if you make no special adjustment, it might happen that in the first year the company has a profit of 1000, in the second year also it has a profit of 1000. Let us say in the first year it had 100 shares, in the second year, at the beginning of the second year, it did a 1:1 bonus, and as a result it had 200 shares. A reader of the financial statement will see this as 10, this as 5, and अपन देखते जैसे हेडलाइन आप देखो न्यूज़पेपर में, हेडलाइन बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट रहता है. वैसे तो आर्टिकल में बहुत कुछ क्लैरिफिकेशन दिया रहता है, बट इफ अ हेडलाइन इज misleading, it might result in people making wrong interpretations. And hence, when you show on the face of the income statement in the last year 10 rupees, in the current year 5 rupees, a reader might believe that company का performance half हो गया. कोई performance half नहीं हुआ. Bonus shares have been issued, but company में एक नया रुपया आया नहीं है. And as a result, AS20 requires you, अच्छा मेरा AS19 रह गया ना बीच में, sorry. AS20 requires you, so we'll do AS19 after this. I'm sorry. इसमें अपन गिनती भूल गए पढ़ाते पढ़ाते. So when we look at AS20, AS20 tells you that the bonus shares have to be retrospectively adjusted. What do you mean by retrospectively adjusted? It means that bonus shares are assumed to be in existence from the earliest reported date, which means if you are preparing 2 years financial statements, from the earliest date that you are reporting, that is 2 years, उसका जो सबसे पहला दिन है, from this very date bonus shares are assumed to be in existence. Were they in existence? No, but they are assumed, so that what will happen is your EPSs are now comparable. अपन बोलते नहीं shares existence में ही नहीं था तो कैसे ले सकते हैं? Well, these shares are in any case without consideration. These shares are given out of amount which is there in your reserves, and as a result they don't give you any fresh consideration. Otherwise someone can say कि नहीं, अगर हमारे पास 200 शेयर है तो भी हमने 1000 रुपए का प्रॉफिट कमाया, हमारे पास 100 शेयर है तो भी 1000 का प्रॉफिट कमाया. Yes, if you had received money for these additional 100 shares and you would have still earned 1000, that means you're utilizing your capital inefficiently. Here you have not received any extra money, and hence in order to ensure comparability we adjust the bonus retrospectively from the earliest reported date. Achha, then comes one of the most important things that is there, and that is on your rights issue. So when we look at rights issue, क्या हो गया, hang हो गया. One of the most important things that is there, that is on the rights issue. So when we look at the rights issue, किधर चले गया ये? Okay, sorry. When we look at rights issue, is rights issue for consideration? Yes. But is there a hidden bonus element? Yes, because rights issue is always at a concessional price. The rights issue is always at a concessional price, and as a result, there is a hidden bonus element which is always hidden inside a rights issue. So what do you have to do? Well, as per the standard, you have to calculate what is called as a theoretical X rights price. What do we mean by theoretical X rights price? It means that if after the rights issue goes through, what will be the price after the rights issue? Well, let us say the rights ratio is 1:5. So there are 5 shares, and before the rights, the market price is 20 rupees. So over here, there are 5 shares whose market price is 20 rupees, and you can subscribe to one more share. And this rights issue price is, let us say, 15 rupees. So if I were to buy 5 shares and then subscribe to a rights issue, then I will spend 100 for those 5 shares and then additional 15 for the 6th share, and hence my total value for the 6 shares put together will be 115 upon 6, which will come to, let us say, 115 upon 6, which will come to, I think, 19.17. Let us say this is 19.17, and this will give you a theoretical X rights price. From this, you will calculate what is called as RAF, that is a rights adjustment factor. What is a rights adjustment factor? We will say that the price prior to the rights issue. कितना था, एक काम करते हैं, इसको और थोड़ा नीचे लेके जाते हैं. Just a second. Let me just work this around properly. Let's say this was 12 or this was 6 rupees to make it easy. Just a second. Or this was 8 rupees. So this is, let us say, 108. And 108 upon 6 comes to 18. So we will say that the price prior to the rights issue was 20. However, after the rights issue is done, the price falls down to 18, and hence due to the rights issue, the adjustment factor is 1.11111. So what are we supposed to do? Well, while calculating your weighted average number of equity shares, for every share outstanding prior to the date of right, you will multiply the RAF. For shares outstanding prior to the date of rights, prior to the date of right, you will multiply the rights adjustment factor. Uska logic hai, we have discussed this in class, that this 0.11111 is actually the hidden bonus element, and hence bonus has to be retrospectively adjusted. So prior to the date of right, जो भी अपना हिडन बोनस एलिमेंट है वो अपन मल्टीप्लाई करके एडजस्ट कर लेते हैं. After the rights issue goes through, you will add all the number of shares that you have issued in any case in the denominator, and hence there is no separate adjustment required. So for all the shares outstanding prior to the rate of rights, you will multiply the RAF and you will do the workings, and that will take care of the rights issue. Achha, then you go to the diluted EPS workings. What do you mean by diluted EPS? Well, diluted EPS is calculated considering your equity shares which have been issued along with the potential equity shares. What do we mean by potential equity shares? These are equity shares which have the potential to be converted. These are not equity shares, these are instruments, can be convertible. Debentures can be convertible, preference shares can be warrants, can be options, but they do have the potential of getting converted into equity shares, though they are not equity shares immediately. And hence, the standard says, let us present the worst possible picture to our shareholders, to our readers, that what if these potential equity shares, whose conversion is not in our control, what if these potential equity shares actually exercise their conversion right and actually convert. Have they converted? Not yet. Achha, if they have converted, they are no longer potential, they are actual equity shares, will go in the basic EPS calculation. However, if they have not yet exercised, but they do have the potential to exercise, what if they exercise? Then what will be the impact on your EPS? So let us take the example of preference shares. If there are convertible preference shares, typically while calculating basic EPS, you would have in the numerator taken PAT minus preference dividend, and you would have taken weighted average number of equity shares. However, if the preference shares were converted, then you will end up saving the preference dividend. Remember, preference dividend is not tax deductible, and hence it will not help you save tax, but that will increase your profit. In the numerator, earlier, the amount of money available for only equity shares was PAT minus PD, but now the amount available for equity shares as well as potential shares is after adding back the preference dividend, and to this in the denominator you will have to add the number of shares on conversion of the preference shares. Achha, is it possible that debentures can get converted? Yes, if they are convertible debentures, and if debentures are converted, from when are they converted? Well, usually from the beginning of the year or from the date of the issue of those debentures or preference shares, as the case may be, whichever is later. So over here, if the debentures are converted, yes, this will help you in saving interest. But interest, remember, comes with the tax deductibility. So in the current year, as a matter of fact, interest was paid and hence tax deduction must have been obtained. However, if interest was not paid, if you are assuming a conversion, then interest is saved, but then that your profit before tax will increase and so will your tax, and hence the adjustment for interest will happen with the 1 minus t, and in the denominator you will have the number of shares on conversion of debentures. Now apart from this, there can also be options or warrants. The difference in the workings for an option or a warrant is, in case of preference shares or in case of debentures, if the conversion happens, there is no real money that will flow. It is just a book entry. So if we assume that the conversion happens at the beginning of the year, your journal entry will be convertible debentures account debit to equity share capital. You are not going to receive a single unit of money. However, if there are options or warrants where the holder has an option to convert them into equity shares, if he exercises the option, he will also give you money. The money does not go into your P&L account, but the money will be received had you converted or exercised, and that money can be used for the purpose of business. So over here, in case of options, let us say there are options that are issued by the entity, and there are, let us say, 1,000 such options with a conversion ratio of 1:1. Let us say the exercise price is rupees 50, which means for conversion they will pay 50, and let us say the average market price during the year is rupees 80. So what will happen is, when options are exercised, you will actually end up issuing 1,000 shares. However, at the same time, you will also receive money, that is 1,000 shares into rupees 50. 50,000 milega. What will I do with that money? Well, two schools of thought. You can assume that, well, I can go to the market and buy back my own equity shares. Then how many equity shares will I buy back? Well, when I go to buy back, I will have to buy back at 80 rupees. So this is 1,000 into 50 upon 80, and hence I can buy back 625 shares. And hence at the end of the day, I will still be left with 375 shares. Or alternatively, the logic over here is, these shares, if you would have issued in the market, you could have raised 20,000 rupees, 50,000 rupees, you would have raised 50,000 rupees in the market by merely issuing 625 shares. But you actually ended up issuing 1,000 shares, and hence the additional 375 shares you are issuing free without any consideration. And hence an adjustment will have to be done for this 375. Why not the entire 1,000? Because 1,000 messes 625 shares are issued for consideration. The remaining 375 are without consideration. Have you received the consideration? No. And hence you can't even consider the shares which are against that consideration. And that is a logic for taking only the free element. So in case of an ESOP, in case of an option or a warrant, you don't really pay anything to the options or warrants as interest or dividend, so nothing will be adjusted in the numerator, but in the denominator you will have to adjust the free element that is there. Okay, so that is about AS 20. Then you go to AS 19, which is on leases. These are very important standards. AS 19, which is on leases. Now lease transactions are like rental transactions, and there are two types of leases. There is a finance lease and then there is an operating lease. How do you define a finance lease? A finance lease is defined as a lease where the risks and rewards incidental to the asset are substantially transferred to the lessee. An operating lease is negatively defined. So if a lease is not a finance lease, it is defined as an operating lease. Acha, in case of finance lease, are there any circumstances which the institute has given? Yes, they have given 5 specific circumstances which are finance leases. First, if the ownership is to be transferred at the end of lease term, ownership automatically transfers at the end of lease term, for example, hire purchase. So risks and rewards are naturally with the lessee. If the ownership does not get transferred, however, there is an option to transfer ownership, and this option is at a price which is at a substantially lower price as compared to the prevailing market price. And hence, it is very highly likely that the lessee will exercise the option to buy the asset. Third, the lease term covers a major part of the economic life, and major part has not been defined. However, it can be interpreted as greater than 75%. Major part, lease term covers a major part of economic life of the asset. Usually your regular leases don't cover almost the entire life of the asset. If your lease term is covering more than 75% of the life of the asset, it is highly likely that you will take all the benefits and bear all the risks of the asset as well. Point 4, the present value of what you call as minimum lease payments, MLP, substantially cover. Substantially is a very strong word, and hence it is read as greater than 90%. Substantially cover. The present value of minimum lease payments substantially cover the fair market value of the asset. So if you are paying more than 90% in today's terms for an asset whose market price is, let us say 100, you are paying close to 90, 95, 98 or even 100 in today's terms. This is undoubtedly you are paying for almost the entire asset, and hence you will be ready to pay such a big amount only if you are fairly certain to receive substantially all the benefits out of the asset. Or the asset is of a highly specialized nature and can be used by the lessee only and cannot be used by any other person without making any major modifications. So if any one of these is satisfied, your lease is very clearly a finance lease. If all of them are not satisfied, that is when it is an operating lease. a few crucial terms on what is a lease term. Lease term will obviously include the non-cancelable period, but apart from that, it will also include the renewal period if we are reasonably certain that the renewal option will be exercised. What is minimum lease payments? Well, minimum lease payments will include lease rent, which has been agreed. Contingent rent is not included. It is minimum, and hence contingent rent is not included, plus the guaranteed residual value. In case of the lessee, this is the guaranteed residual value of the lessee only. In case of the lessor, it can be the guaranteed residual value given by the lessee or even an independent third party, because lessor does not really care पैसा कहां से आता है. Lessee agrees to buy and pay the money, or a third party agrees, does not really matter. Then we go to the discounting factor. What should be the discounting factor? The discounting factor is called as the interest rate implicit in the lease, which will usually be the lessor's IRR, that is internal rate of return. And if lessor's IRR is not available, then we can take the lessee's incremental borrowing rate. Then what is going to be the accounting? Well, accounting in the books of the lessee, in case of a finance lease, this is in the books of the lessee, in case of a finance lease, and in case of an operating lease. In case of a finance lease, at the time of initial recognition, you will recognize the transaction as a purchase of asset. In case of finance lease, as a purchase of asset on a loan, and hence you will recognize the asset and asset account debit to, let us say, lease liability. चलो जोश में आपने record तो कर दिया, but what will be the amount? Because this is actually a rental transaction, and hence the standard tells you that you will record it at the lower of the PV of MLP, that is your actual payment that you are going to make, which is the most logical number, or the fair value. क्यों? Because आपको ऐसा नहीं चाहिए कि आप asset fair value से ज्यादा recognize कर दो. Hire purchase, you might have studied that if you are paying anything more than the cash price of the asset, that is not for the asset, that is for interest, and hence the maximum amount that you can recognize is the amount the maximum amount that you can recognize is attributable to the fair value only. Acha, now you have recorded this transaction not as a lease transaction but a borrow and buy transaction, in which case every year if a lease payment is made, we will not treat it as a lease payment. Instead, we will treat it as a repayment of lease liability and the attached interest. So the annual entries over here would be asset है तो वो depreciate भी होगा. So this is depreciation account debit to, let us say, the asset, and lease liability, the lease rent that you pay, this will no longer be called as lease rent account debit to bank. Instead, you will recognize interest. So that is finance cost, that is interest to bank. Acha, you might end up paying 10 rupees and interest comes to, let us say, 8 rupees. Then the remaining amount is treated as repayment of principal. So this is exactly like a borrow and buy transaction in your P&L. Instead of lease rent going in your P&L, instead of a lease rent going, you will have the interest. Just a second. Okay. Instead of a lease rent going, you will have interest taken. So this is about your finance lease. When you go to the operating lease, in case of an operating lease, at initial recognition, there is no entry. Why? Because it is just a rental transaction. You have not secured any benefits of ownership of the asset. At each year, you will recognize lease rent as an expense, account debit to bank, and this lease rent will be taken to the profit and loss account. Lease rent account debit to bank, and lease rent will be taken to the profit and loss account. Acha, when we recognize this lease rent, where will this lease rent go? P&L. Acha, can the lease rent vary? Yes, it can. However, AS 19 says that you have to see whether this lease rent is varying due to certain systematic factor. For example, more area, or for example, due to inflation, or it is varying due to an unknown factor. So AS 19 requires you to recognize this lease rent, remember, on a straight line basis unless a systematic factor is evident. What do you mean by that? For example, if you have agreed to a lease rent of 10, 20, 30 and 40 over 4 years, in which case ideally why would the lease rent for the same property differ? Stands as a possibility, and hence you will recognize a lease rent as 25 per annum. In each year you will have either a deferred rent or a lease equalization account. For example, the journal entry in the first year would be lease rent account debit 25 to bank 10 to lease equalization 15. However, if you can prove that this is due to more area, in the first year 100 square feet, in the second year 200 square feet, in the third year 300 square feet, and so on, then a lease equalization or equalization is not required. In other cases it is required. That is about the lessee. When you go to the books of the lessor ke books mein entries are going to be exactly the opposite. So in case the lessor enters into a finance lease, that means the lessor transfers the risks and rewards incidental to the ownership of the asset, then the lessor has to de-recognize the asset out of his books, and in lieu of that he has to recognize a receivable. Like lessee recognizes a payable, a lessor has to recognize a receivable. So in case of a finance lease, your journal entry will be lease receivable account debit to asset. अच्छा, if it is a manufacturer lessor, तो यहाँ पे आप sale भी recognize कर सकते हो. This is in case of a finance lease. At what value will you recognize it? Here you will recognize it at what you call as the net investment in the lease. How do you find the net investment in the lease? Well, there are few lessor specific terms. First is gross investment. This is calculated as MLP, which will obviously include the guaranteed residual value. MLP is the lease rent plus the guaranteed residual value plus what you have as the unguaranteed residual value. What is the unguaranteed residual value? The total residual value that you estimate minus the guaranteed residual value. This is the gross investment. The net investment is the present value of the gross investment, and there is something called as unearned finance income. Unearned finance income will be recognized as the gross investment minus net investment. So basically, as per AS 19, you can recognize the lease receivable at the net investment, which is basically the present value of minimum lease payments plus also the present value of unguaranteed residual value. We have discussed the logic in class. The logic for including the unguaranteed residual value is when you look at the lessor knows his IRR, and when lessor would have calculated his IRR, when you have done in capital budgeting, lessor would have also included his overall salvage value, whether it was guaranteed or unguaranteed. And as a result, in the books of the lessor, you take both the guaranteed as well as unguaranteed residual value. While you do capital budgeting through which you calculate IRR, you don't just take the guaranteed residual value, you take the salvage value for the entire item, and hence the unguaranteed residual value is also included for the lessor. Acha, then we look at the annual entries. This is entry at initial recognition. The annual entries would be, well, the asset is sold, so there is not really sold, but the risk and reward is transferred, so it is de-recognized, so there is no depreciation. However, the money is still going to be received, and hence the entries would be bank account debit, but this is treated as a recovery of a receivable to finance income. This is like your interest income, which will go to the profit and loss account, to lease receivable. You will first calculate the interest, and the balancing figure, if any, will be taken as the lease receivable. Then you go to operating lease. Again, initially no entry. At each year, you will record the lease income received as an income. So this is bank to lease rent, and this is lease rent income, which will go in the profit and loss account. Again on a straight line basis, unless a systematic basis can be shown otherwise. Next, you go to the case of sale and leaseback. Typically, why would you do a sale and leaseback transaction? Well, a sale and leaseback is done in order to generate funds. It is more of a financing transaction, is done in order to generate funds. How do you account for a sale and leaseback transaction? In case of a sale and leaseback, as we have discussed detailed examples on this, it depends on whether the leaseback is a finance lease or the leaseback is an operating lease. So if the leaseback is a finance lease, what actually happens is when you sell, the risk and reward gets transferred to the lessee, and when you lease it back through a finance lease, the risk and reward comes back to you, in which case there is no point de-recognizing the asset. And hence there's no point recognizing a gain or loss on sale in the P&L immediately, because the asset is still with you. How can you recognize a gain or loss on the sale of asset if the asset's risks and rewards are still with you? And hence in such a case, the gain, what we are looking at is the gain or loss on sale will be deferred it will be recorded in the deferred gain account and it will be deferred in the ratio of depreciation. The asset is there in your books and in the ratio of depreciation. जैसे आप revaluation reserve में करते हो वैसे आप gain or loss defer करोगे. You might sell the asset which is a WDV of 60 for 100 rupees and then lease it back and agree to pay the worth 100 rupees, in which case we are trying to say that your 40 का gain है बराबर है, but वो 60 का asset अभी आपने recognize कर दिया at PV of MLP that is 100 rupees and hence that 40 gain will be deferred in the ratio of depreciation. Acha, what if the lease back is in the nature of operating lease? Acha, if it is in the nature of operating lease, we have two cases if you remember. First is the normal case where the selling price is less than or equal to fair value. This is normal. In order to make a sale, it is very normal that you give discounts. And the second case, which is a slightly unusual case, where the selling price is greater than the fair value. What does Institute require you to do in the first case? Well, it says whatever is a gain or loss can be taken into the P&L immediately. Gain or loss in P&L immediately unless you can specifically prove that the lease rent is compensating. However, in the second case, what does the Institute require you to do? It says that देखो by selling price, here Institute does not say it in so many words, but it kind of believes that this is very unusual. Sale or lease back करते वक्त, usually it is usual to see products which are sold at less than, आप खरीदने जाओ products, so कितने manufacturers MRP के नीचे बेचते हैं, MRP के ऊपर बेचना थोड़ा unusual है. And hence the standard believes that if something like this is happening, then whatever is the excess probably is going to be compensated through a future lease rental. And hence it says that the supernormal profit, that is SP minus FV, this has to be deferred. अच्छा, यहाँ पे तो कोई ratio of depreciation या कुछ है नहीं, so this has to be deferred in the ratio of lease rent. However, the second part where where there is FV minus SP, FV minus WDV, I'm sorry, this is a normal profit. So let us say the WDV was 60, fair value was 70 and the selling price is 100. Institute believes it is normal to sell it at 70 and hence 10 ka profit hai. It has to be recognized in P&L immediately because the leaseback is operating and hence you are making the sale, so transferring the risk and reward, but at the same time the leaseback is operating and hence you are not getting substantially the risk and reward incidental to ownership. So the difference between these two, that is 10, can be taken into the P&L. So this is gain or loss in the P&L. However, the difference between these two, now we are scratching our head that how can you sell something at a price which is higher than the fair value? Well, probably because you might have agreed कि भाई आज मेरे को पैसे का जरूरत है तो 100 दे दे, मैं तेरे को फ्यूचर में लीज रेंट देने वाला हूं ना, तो I will give you a higher lease rent. Institute does not ask you to verify any of this. It requires you to make this treatment on an implicit assumption. Hence, the 30 rupees over here will be deferred in the ratio of the lease rent. Fair. So this is about AS 19. 20 is already done. Then you go to your favorite standard, a standard which I would believe is very unfortunate to be included in your inter-CS syllabus. It was not there, and rightly so, in your IPCC syllabus. It is there in your inter-CS syllabus, AS22, which is on deferred taxes, a slightly harsh standard. Now at this stage you would have done a lot of income tax and hence you might be in a slightly better position to grasp this standard as well. Assuming you're also giving group 1 and you've done income tax. Now what is a deferred tax and why do you need this deferred tax? Okay, so over here what does happen is the tax that you have to pay in each year is based on the principles of the Income Tax Act of 1961, which, as you would be aware as aspiring chartered accountants, is different from the principles enumerated in AS. There are a lot of differences. For example, income tax has block method of depreciation. WDV, books of accounts, does not have block method. Income tax requires a preliminary expenses to be spread over 5 years. Books of accounts does not require that. Income tax says certain items, section 43B items, will be allowed as like interest paid, will be allowed as a deduction only when it is actually paid. Books of accounts says irrespective of whether paid or not, if expenses accrued, you will get a deduction. And hence there might be differences. Now the problem is when a reader is given annual report, along with the annual report, he is not given the computation of income. वो income tax का जो return होता है वो confidential होता है, वो कभी annual report में share नहीं होता. But annual report के अंदर you have been given your financial statements, that is your P&L account, and in your P&L account you have been given in your P&L account, you have been given the profits as calculated as per books of accounts using AS principles. But the moment you try to calculate the tax expense that you have to pay to the government, that is not based on your profits in the books of accounts, it is based on profits as per Income Tax Act of 1961. And as a result, there might be a disconnect, a non-matching, and hence comes the concept of deferred tax. So what does AS22 say? AS22 says that you have to evaluate your differences into two categories. First, there is something called as timing difference, and second, there is something called as a permanent difference. What do you mean by timing difference? This is a difference between the accounting profit and the income tax profit, which arises in one of the years and it will reverse in a subsequent year. I will again repeat, it arises in one of the years and will reverse in the subsequent year. For example, 43B item. Currently, income tax disallows it. So income tax profit is higher, deduction kam mila, interest expense ka, books of accounts profit is lower. However, when I actually paid, books of accounts will not again give me a deduction, but income tax will. And as a result, there is a difference which arises in the current year in the calculation of profits, but the difference is temporary in nature. It will reverse in one of the future years. So AS believes that if the profits are different due to a temporary item, then in the current year, if you have calculated the profits and uske hisab se ek particular tax aa raha hai, you might come up to the conclusion that you have actually saved tax or you have actually paid more tax or less tax. That is incorrect. You have just postponed tax. For example, if the profit before depreciation and tax as per accounts is 100 and depreciation as per books is, let us say, 10, and profit before depreciation and tax as per income tax is also 100 and tax depreciation is slightly higher, let us say this is 40, and hence the profit before tax in the books is 90, profit before tax in income tax is 60. If you actually calculate the tax rate, let us say that is 30%, you will come to a tax expense of 18. So when you show in your books of accounts, you will show what is called as a current tax of 18 rupees, and hence 90 minus 18 is going to come to what? 72. A reader will be very happy. अरे पूरे दुनिया में 30% टैक्स चल रहा है, आपने सिर्फ 20% भरा, वो गलत है. 10% or basically ideally 90 का आप 30% निकालो should come to 27, but you are paying only 18. That means, are you saving 9? No, you are just postponing it, because in the future years, let us assume income tax gives you depreciation of 40 rupees in the first 2 years and 20 rupees in the third year. Let us assume books of accounts gives you 10 rupees each year, in which case income tax में 3 साल बाद depreciation ही नहीं मिलेगा, but books of accounts will continue to give you depreciation. So from the 4th year onwards, income tax में आपका profit higher दिखेगा. Is that because you are earning more? No, that is because you have already claimed a deduction in the earlier years. So this is what you call as, this is not saving of tax of 9, this is merely postponement of tax. के आज के बदले future में tax pay करना पड़ेगा. Then we will show this as the deferred tax. So deferred tax, the birth of deferred tax is linked to timing or temporary differences if the differences are permanent. For example, section 35 items, weighted deduction, contribution to scientific research, we are giving 1.75 times or 2 times weighted deduction. हमने आज 10 rupees pay kiya. Books of accounts gave you deduction of 10 rupees. Income tax will give you double deduction. Let us say 20 rupees. Will that ever reverse? No. And hence that difference of 10 will be permanent in nature. Then what is the point of creating a deferred tax liability or a deferred tax item अगर वो कभी reverse ही नहीं होने वाला है? And hence for permanent differences, there's no point creating a deferred tax, because deferred tax liability is like an outstanding expense account and a deferred tax asset is something like a prepaid asset account. तो वो फ्यूचर में रिवर्स तो होना चाहिए ना. अगर वो वेटेड डिडक्शन कभी फ्यूचर में रिवर्स ही नहीं होने वाला है, तो आपने एक्चुअली टैक्स बचा है. दुनिया को बताओ कि हमारे सिर्फ 18 का टैक्स है. ऑन द अदर हैंड, if this difference was due to a timing item, then they're just playing with the matching concept. You might in a few years be very happy that less tax is paid, in a few years be very agitated that more tax is paid. So we try to even out tax, and hence comes the concept of deferred tax. The deferred tax arises on timing differences. On permanent differences, remember, deferred tax is not created. What are the principles of deferred tax? Well, typically you will compare the accounting profit with the income tax profit. If the accounting profit is higher, now this can be higher due to two reasons. The accounting expense, so this can be higher due to two reasons. The accounting expense is less than the tax expense. For example, tax में आपको depreciation ज़्यादा मिल गया. Or it can be due to the accounting revenue being greater than the tax revenue. Tax में आपने, for example, construction contracts, full completion method is followed. In either of these two cases, what is going to happen is, because the tax profit is lower, you will pay lesser current tax. But if that difference is due to a temporary item or a timing difference, आज आपने कम टैक्स पे किया, फ्यूचर में ज्यादा पे करना पड़ेगा, which is representative of a liability. So this will always create a deferred tax liability. On the other hand, if your accounting profit and you compare it with the tax profit, your tax profit is higher. It may be due to disallowance of an expense. So if an expense is disallowed, tax में expenditures आपके total कम रहेंगे, books of accounts में expenditures ज़्यादा रहेंगे. Or it may be due to a higher revenue being shown in tax, higher revenue shown in tax, a lower revenue shown in accounts. And hence, in such a case, you will have to pay more tax in the current year. But if the difference is temporary, like a 43B item or a section 35D item, जहाँ पे आपको preliminary expenses, books of accounts gives you full deduction. 500 है तो 500 का पूरा deduction. Income tax 100 करके 5 साल के ऊपर देगा. So in the first year, it might appear that books में 500 का खर्चा है, income tax में सिर्फ 100 का ही खर्चा है. But in the subsequent year, books में वापस deduction नहीं मिलेगा. Income tax will keep on giving you deduction. So it might appear that in the current year you are paying more tax. You are actually prepaying it. You are just prepaying tax like a prepaid asset. And as a result, this will create what you call as a deferred tax asset. Acha, can you show deferred tax asset and liability separately, or do you have to net them off? Well, you can net them off and show the net item, because unless otherwise given, they arise out of the same laws and they can be offsetted and paid net. What about deferred tax liability? Should it always be created? Yes. Deferred tax liability का entry होगा profit and loss, deferred tax expense, which goes in the profit and loss account, debit to deferred tax liability. But deferred tax asset का क्या entry होगा? It will be deferred tax asset account debit to deferred tax expense, which will be credited to the P&L. Here the principle of conservatism and prudence kicks in, and it says, well, you are crediting the P&L. It's like a contingent asset. Can you credit the P&L? Ideally, no. Under AS 29, no, you can't. However, AS 22 overrides, and AS 22 says, well, you can credit it provided there is a reasonable assurance that the profits will be earned in order to utilize these benefits. अगर आपको लग रहा है प्रॉफिट ही नहीं कमाएंगे तो बराबर है, आज अपने ज्यादा टैक्स भर दिया, बट नेक्स्ट ईयर हमको लग रहा है प्रॉफिट ही नहीं होगा, then what is the point of creating an asset when you know as a matter of fact or you are uncertain कि आगे के फ्यूचर में प्रॉफिट्स होगा नहीं. अगर फ्यूचर में प्रॉफिट्स नहीं तो टैक्स ही नहीं भरने को आएगा, then how are you going to realize the tax savings? Again, there is a special case of a carry forward loss. So basically, deferred tax assets can be created only if there is a reasonable assurance of sufficient future taxable profits that will be earned in order to utilize these losses. Then comes the principle of carry forward losses. Remember, carry forward losses, books of accounts does not have any carry forward. If there's a loss of a current year, it is reported as net loss of that year. But in income tax, if there's a loss, the total income is taken as zero and that loss is put in the carry forward losses schedule. And hence, when the carry forward loss is actually utilized in the future years, you will pay less tax in the future years. Books of accounts, next year में profit आएगा तो next year में net profit दिखाएगा, first year में loss है तो loss दिखाएगा. So carry forward losses always create deferred tax assets, and carry forward losses have a life of only 8 years, and hence the standard says that you can actually create a deferred tax asset for carry forward losses only if there's virtual certainty that there will be profits that will be earned at a future date. So this is about your deferred taxes. There are certain other special cases also in deferred taxes. For example, MAT, that is minimum alternative tax. As we have discussed, MAT is just, you will study MAT in detail at your final CA, but MAT is just a way of ensuring that the government keeps on getting regular revenue. MAT का आपको credit मिलता है. If what is MAT? You have to pay the higher of income tax or MAT. Let us say MAT is higher. इन विच केस क्या पे करना पड़ेगा, मैट पे करना पड़ेगा. मैट इज द मैट रेट इनटू बुक प्रॉफिट्स. वो एक अलग ही वर्किंग होता है सेक्शन 115 JB के हिसाब से of Income Tax Act. You'll have to pay that. अच्छा, but let us say income tax was 30, MAT is 40, you'll have to pay 40, but वो जो extra 10 पे कर रहे हो उसका आपको credit मिल जाता है. And hence AS22 believes that is not really a tax because you can get a credit over the next 15 years, you can claim a credit. And hence your real tax is 30 only. So while calculating deferred tax, you will ignore the MAT rate as well as the book profit. You will only look at the accounting profit in the books and the tax rate and the tax profit as per Income Tax Act. Ignore MAT. Acha, also another case is section 80 IA, 80 IB, section 10A, 10B, tax exemptions, tax holidays. If you are granted a tax holiday, you are a company which is granted a tax holiday, the standard says that deferred tax should be created for only those differences which are created during the tax holiday period and reversed after the tax holiday period. If the differences are created in the tax holiday, like 80 IA gives you a tax exemption for 5 years. If the difference is created within the tax holiday, that is in the first year, and reverses within the tax holiday, let us say in the 4th year or 5th year, then इट इज नॉट फर्स्ट ईयर में हम ज्यादा या कम टैक्स पे भी नहीं करते और जब वो रिवर्स होएगा तभी उसका कोई सेकंड इंपैक्ट भी नहीं आता बिकॉज 5 years तक टैक्स एग्जेम्पशन है. However, if the difference gets created in the tax holiday period, but it reverses after the tax holiday period when you are actually taxable, then उसके लिए आपको defer tax करना पड़ेगा. Long story short, we have done cases on this as well, but long story short, deferred tax needs to be created for differences which arise during the tax holiday period and reverse after the tax holiday period. It is not to be created for differences which arise during tax holiday and reverse also during the tax holiday. So this is about your dreaded AS22. Yes, you need a little more reading on this. It is not something which goes as naturally. This standard is a little daunting. Then comes the next standard, which is AS24. This is a slightly easy standard, not very important from an exam perspective. This is on discontinuing operations. It's more of a theory standard. Two important things on this standard. First, understanding what is a discontinuing operation. Second, understanding what is the initial disclosure event. A discontinuing operation is a component of an entity or a line of geography or a business which an entity plans to discontinue pursuant to a single plan. So, for example, if I might have 3 divisions, the coaching division, the CA practice division, and the restaurant division, and I would say, नहीं बस यार, अभी बहुत हुआ, हमें restaurant आगे continue नहीं करना है, and hence that entire line of business I want to discontinue. That is what is a discontinuing operation, which I want to discontinue pursuant to a single plan, which represents a separate major line of business or geography and for whom detailed financial records are available. Sir, ये सब करके मतलब क्या है? Well, when I prepare my financial statements, I will typically prepare my profit and loss and I will just show total for all the segments. When a reader looks at my profit or loss of the current year, he will try to forecast the next year's profit and loss. But if I'm discontinuing one of the segments, he will not be aware of that, and hence the standard requires that you prepare your detailed line by line profit and loss account only for the continuing operations. For the discontinuing operations, yes, it is not yet discontinued, it is discontinuing, present tense, and as a result, you will show this, the profit earned from division C as a separate line item in the profit and loss account and not total sales, total expenses, वो सब नहीं दिखाओगे. अब सीधा profit from discontinuing operations एक separate line item दिखेगा. Your sales, expenses, everything will be shown only for continuing operations, and after the profit of continuing operations is determined, a profit for discontinuing operations will be shown as a separate line item. Okay. There are certain cases which the standard tells you are not discontinuing operations. For example, you might have a phasing out of a product in favor of another product, like Maruti phasing out a Maruti 800 in view of making a Maruti Alto is not a discontinuing operation. This is rebalancing of your products. Or shifting of a geography. Let us say Apple shifting its production from, let us say, China to India is not a discontinuing operation. It is just rebalancing of its geographies. So these are not discontinuing operations. Acha, when will you start showing discontinuing operations separately and give notes and disclosures about them? From the date of initial disclosure event. What is the initial disclosure event? It is the date which is the date when either a detailed formal announcement is made, a public announcement is made by the board of its plan to discontinue, or there's a binding agreement that is signed. कितनी बार क्या होता है, ये सब confidential होता है, so you don't want the world to know कि आप ये डिविजन डिसकंटिन्यू कर दिया, बट एक बार आपने पब्लिक अनाउंसमेंट कर दिया, उसके बाद तो पूरी दुनिया को पता है, then disclose it separately. और आपने पब्लिक अनाउंसमेंट किया नहीं, but a binding sale agreement has been signed. So you will look at the date when a formal announcement is made, the public announcement is made, or a binding sale agreement is signed, whichever is earlier. From that date, the disclosures will start. That is AS24. It's not a very important standard. Next, you go to AS26. This is a smaller brother of AS10 that you would study in your paper 1. This is on intangible assets. What are intangible assets? Assets that, as you say, you cannot touch, feel and see. There are 3 features of intangible assets. First, it has to be identifiable. That means it has to be either separable, that you can sell it separately, capable of being sold separately, or it's a license which arises out of a separate contract or a law. Then it has to be non-monetary in nature. The value in the balance sheet does not represent the realizable value, and then it lacks physical substance. That is, you can't touch, feel and see. That is when it is an intangible asset as per AS26. Can you show intangible assets in your books of accounts? Well, yes, if they give future economic benefits, they fulfill these criteria, and their cost is measurable. For a lot of self-generated items, their cost may not be measurable, like brands, etc. If they are not measurable, then you cannot show it separately in the balance sheet. For items like deferred revenue expenses, like big advertisement campaigns, like big training expenses, you cannot show it as an intangible asset because it does not meet the identifiability criteria. You can't remove and sell the advertising campaign itself separately, so it is not separable. And again, the advertising or the training does not give you a license or a contractual right, and hence it does not meet the identifiability criteria. And the moral of the story is deferred revenue expenses, as you have studied in foundation, can never be capitalized under AS26. Instead, they are expenses, they are not assets, and hence they have to be taken to the profit and loss account. A very important point over here is understanding the accounting for research and development expenses. And in today's COVID scenario, it is you will hear companies spending millions and billions of dollars behind research and development. What do you do with research and development? Typically for software and pharmaceutical companies, research expenses are to be taken. What is the research phase? It is the ideation phase. We have not yet found a solution. We are just trying to ideate. We are trying to find a cure for the COVID-19. That is the research phase. Expenses have to be taken to the P&L. Why not capitalized? Well, because future economic benefits are not certain. अभी अपने हवे में तीर मार रहे, HIV AIDS के लिए लोग 2-3 decades से मेहनत कर रहे, 20-30 years से मेहनत कर रहे, before you are even born. So it is not necessary that you are going to find a cure, and hence till the time future economic benefits are not certain, you cannot recognize it as an asset. On the other hand, when we look at a development expense is after the research phase ends. For example, you have found a molecule which can kill the COVID virus. However, you need to do a lot of trials, which a lot of these big companies like AstraZeneca, etc. are doing. You need to do a lot of trials to see whether this actually works and what are the side effects, etc. And hence, expenditure incurred during the development phase can be capitalized subject to conditions. It can be capitalized subject to conditions. And what are the conditions over here? Well, the conditions over here is that the product should be technologically or technically feasible. It should be legally possible to be made. It should be financially viable. So the benefits that you are getting should be greater than the cost incurred, and the cost has to be measurable. If all of these criteria are met, that is when you will say that you can show the development asset separately. Else, even expenditures incurred during the development phase will be expensed to the profit and loss account. Okay, this is about expenditures that you are incurring during the development phase. If you are not certain, institute says that if you are unable to figure out whether you are in the research or the development phase, you can assume that you are in the research phase and you can solve accordingly. What about amortization? Well, intangible assets should be amortized depending on their life. AS26 comes with a rebuttable inbuilt presumption that the life of an intangible asset cannot exceed beyond 10 years unless it can be proven otherwise. So if the intangible asset has a finite life, it has to be amortized on a systematic basis over its finite life, and if no systematic basis is available, then on a straight line basis, SLM. If it has an indefinite life, like something like a trademark, etc., can have an indefinite life, in which case it will be amortized over the 10-year period, because you cannot prove with conviction that the life is more than 10 years. For assets having a finite life, if you can prove that the life is greater than 10 years, then you can. But from an exam perspective, we will generally take the life or 10 years, whichever is shorter, because unless otherwise given, we will assume that the maximum possible life is 10 years. This is about intangible assets. At what value should you recognize the intangible assets? At initial recognition, you should recognize it at cost, which will include the purchase price, the non-refundable, non-creditable taxes, and the directly attributable expenses, which are to be incurred to get the asset in the ready-to-use condition. Subsequent to that, only those expenses which can increase the life or efficiency beyond the originally assessed will be capitalized. Other expenses will be taken to the P&L. In each year, you will amortize, as we have just discussed over here. So this is your basic principles about intangibles. If the intangible asset is acquired under a barter transaction, you will recognize it at fair value because there's no money paid otherwise. Fair? Okay, so that takes care of AS26, and then finally we reach up to AS29. This is the standalone provisions and contingencies. Over here, we define a liability which is basically based on a present obligation. The obligation exists, it is present, or a contingency which is based on a possible obligation or a potential obligation, a liability which may or may not exist, the outcome of which will be known after certain future events which are beyond the control of the entity. What do you do with contingencies? Well, the standard over here gives you certain guidance. Contingencies depends on whether it is a contingent liability or it is a contingent asset. If it is a contingent liability versus contingent asset, the prudence principle or the conservatism principle tells you that recognize expenses as and when you expect them, incomes when you actually earn them. And hence, if it is a contingent liability which is probable means more likely than not, that is a greater than 50% chance of the event happening. If it is probable, that is a greater than 50% chance, then you will recognize a provision, create an expense and recognize a provision in the books of accounts, pass an entry, not just give a disclosure. However, if it is uncertain, that is, it is a less than 50% chance, less than or equal to 50% chance, then you will give a disclosure in the notes. You will just give a disclosure, you will not record it. However, if it is remote क्या होता है? Well, remote is only if it is given to you in the question, typically at less than 5% chance is remote. नाम का चीज है, वो होएगा ही नहीं. No disclosure is required if it is remote. Can we assume that a particular item is remote? Never. Unless the question tells you it is remote, you will assume that it is uncertain and give a disclosure. Contingent assets, on the other hand, well, contingent assets, if they are virtually certain, then they are no longer probable. Virtual certainty, remember, arises out of facts. If they are virtually certain that पैसा आने ही वाला, इंश्योरेंस कंपनी ने आपको फॉर्मल कम्युनिकेशन दे दिया कि मनी विल बी रिसीव्ड, और a judge has given his verdict that you have won the case, detailed judgment is awaited, then it is virtually certain, in which case you can recognize an asset. However, if it is probable, you will have to give a disclosure. Probable but not virtually certain, then you'll have to give a disclosure. If it is uncertain, let alone remote, if it is uncertain, you will ignore. क्यों? अपने को ऐसा झूठे ख्वाब दिखाने क्यों है रीडर को कि ऐसा कुछ आ सकता है? You will ignore. When you try to measure the provisions, or when you try to measure the contingencies, you will look at all the possibilities. If a probability is required, you will also take the probability and try to measure. The provisions have to be reassessed at each balance sheet date, and they have to be restated to the most recent estimate of the provision. बराबर है. चलो वो केस टू केस देखना पड़ेगा, but this is the main principle which is there in AS29. So I think that is where I've rounded off your standards. I hope this has been clear to you. I can understand it's a bit fast, but we want to cover This is main for dedicated for your exams. So the chapters will not take as much time because you're not solving sums. Standards are a lot of theory, so they do take as much time. So what we can do is we can probably stop for around 5 odd minutes, and you can take a breather. I can take a breather, and then we can continue.